The wind howled across the Montana territory like the breath of some ancient beast, carrying with it crystals of ice that cut through the darkness with razor precision. Margaret Sullivan stood frozen in her cabin doorway, her wool shawl pulled tight against shoulders that had known too many winters of solitude. Before her, emerging from the swirling white chaos of the blizzard, came shapes that defied reason, warriors on horseback, their silhouettes carved from shadow and storm, their eyes fixed upon her with an intensity that made her blood run cold. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. At their head rode a figure she recognized instantly, though 3 weeks had passed since she'd last seen his face. The Apache chief she had pulled from the jaws of death now sat proud and strong in his saddle, no trace remaining of the broken man who had nearly perished in her arms. His gaze met hers across the frozen wasteland, and in that moment, Margaret understood that everything she thought she knew about her life was about to change forever. The warriors had not come to thank her. They had come to claim her. The morning had begun like any other, in the endless succession of days that marked Margaret's existence on the frontier. She rose before dawn, as was her custom, lighting the oil lamp with practiced efficiency, despite fingers stiff from the cold that seemed to live permanently in the cabin's walls. The Montana territory in late November was unforgiving, a landscape painted in shades of gray and white that stretched endlessly toward horizons lost in perpetual mist. Margaret had chosen this isolation deliberately. After the tragedy that took her family, her husband Thomas and their young daughter Emma, she had fled civilization, seeking a place where memories could not follow and where the silence might eventually heal wounds that refused to close. The cabin she now called home sat nestled in a valley between 2 ridges of pine and aspen, a structure Thomas had built with his own hands during their brief time of happiness. Every board, every nail, every carefully chinked gap between logs carried the echo of dreams that would never be fulfilled. She moved through her morning routine with the mechanical precision of someone who had learned to find purpose in the smallest tasks. Water needed to be fetched from the well, though she had to break through a skin of ice that reformed each night. Firewood required splitting, the axe blade ringing against frozen timber with a sound that scattered the silence like glass. The chickens in their small coop demanded feeding, though their production had slowed with the approaching winter. As Margaret worked, she noticed the subtle signs that those who lived close to the land learned to read like scripture. The air carried a particular stillness, heavy with moisture that promised snow. The wind, which had been steady from the northwest for days, suddenly shifted, coming now from the northeast with gusts that spoke of weather systems colliding far beyond the visible horizon. The horses in her small corral, 2 mares she kept for transportation and the occasional trip to the trading post 20 miles distant, stood with their backs to the wind, their thick winter coats already bristling against the cold. By midday, the first flakes began to fall. They came not gently, as snow sometimes did in the early season, but with purpose and weight, each crystal large enough to catch the weak sunlight before settling on the ground with the finality of a grave shroud. Margaret paused in her work of mending a bridle, watching through the cabin's single window as the world outside began its transformation from brown and gray to uniform white. She had lived through many storms in her 3 years of solitude, but something about this one felt different. The wind carried with it not just the promise of heavy snow, but an urgency that made her skin prickle with unease. She found herself checking and rechecking her supplies, the smoked venison hanging in the root cellar, the sacks of flour and beans, the oil for her lamps. Everything was as it should be, yet the anxiety persisted. As afternoon faded into early evening, the storm announced its true intentions. What had begun as steady snowfall became a furious assault of wind and ice. The cabin shook under the force of gusts that seemed determined to lift it from its foundation and scatter its pieces across the valley. Margaret moved about the interior, securing anything that might shift or fall, adding extra logs to the fire that was her only source of warmth against the gathering fury outside. The sound was overwhelming, not just the howl of wind, but the crack and groan of trees bending beyond their limits, the sharp report of branches snapping under the weight of accumulating ice, and beneath it all, a deeper rumble that seemed to come from the earth itself. Margaret had heard stories of storms that could bury entire settlements, leaving only the tops of chimneys visible when spring finally came to reveal the devastation. She prepared for a long siege, filling every available container with water. Before the well became inaccessible, banking the fire with enough fuel to last through the night, and laying out extra blankets and clothing within easy reach. The routine of preparation helped calm her nerves, giving her hands and mind something to focus on besides the violence raging beyond her walls. Night fell early, hastened by the thick clouds that blotted out any trace of moon or stars. Margaret sat by the fire, a cup of weak tea warming her hands, listening to the storm's symphony and trying to remember the last time she had felt truly afraid. Not the everyday wariness that came with frontier life, the awareness of bears, wolves, and the ever-present possibility of accident or injury, but the deep, primal fear that spoke of forces beyond human control or understanding. It was sometime near midnight when she first heard it, a sound that didn't belong to the storm, distinct from the wind's howl and the percussion of ice against wood. At first, she dismissed it as imagination, the mind's tendency to find patterns in chaos. But there it was again, a rhythmic beating that cut through the tempest's roar with disturbing clarity. Margaret rose from her chair, moving to the window and pressing her face against the cold glass. The world outside was a maelstrom of white, visibility reduced to mere feet beyond the porch. Yet as she watched, straining her eyes against the swirling chaos, she caught glimpses of something moving in the storm. Dark shapes that appeared and vanished like phantoms, too large to be debris, too purposeful in their movement to be anything natural. The sound came again, clearer now, the unmistakable rhythm of drums. Not the random percussion of objects blown by wind, but the deliberate, measured beat of instruments played by human hands. Margaret's blood chilled as she realized what she was hearing. In all her years on the frontier, she had heard stories of Apache war parties, of their ability to move unseen through terrain that would defeat lesser men, of their drums that could carry messages across vast distances. But Apache didn't typically venture this far north, especially not in winter storms that would challenge even their legendary endurance. The tribes of this region were Crow and Blackfoot, people she had learned to coexist with through careful respect and the occasional trade of goods. Whatever was moving in the storm beyond her cabin represented something outside her experience, something that made her mouth go dry with a fear she hadn't felt since the night her family died. The drumming grew closer, accompanied now by other sounds, the snort and stamp of horses, the creak of leather, and beneath it all, voices speaking in a language she didn't recognize. Margaret stepped back from the window, her heart hammering against her ribs. She reached for the rifle that hung above the fireplace, checking to ensure it was loaded, though she knew that one weapon would be little defense against a war party. As she stood there, rifle in hand, listening to the approach of whatever forces moved in the storm, Margaret found herself thinking of the choices that had brought her to this moment. The decision to flee civilization after tragedy struck, the determination to live alone rather than accept the well-meaning but suffocating sympathy of distant relatives, the stubborn pride that had made her refuse offers of help from neighboring settlers. All of those choices had led to this night, this moment when she stood alone against unknown dangers with nothing but her courage and a single rifle between her and whatever fate awaited. The sounds grew louder, more distinct, she could make out. Individual voices now, though the words remained incomprehensible. The drums had taken on a different rhythm, slower and more solemn, like a funeral march or a ritual of some kind. Through the howling wind, She heard the nicker of horses and the soft thud of hooves in deep snow. Margaret moved away from the window, positioning herself where she could see the door while remaining partially hidden behind the heavy wooden table Thomas had built for their kitchen. Her hands shook as she gripped the rifle, not from cold, but from the realization that everything about her solitary existence was about to change. The storm had brought more than just snow and ice to her valley. It had carried with it forces that would demand answers to questions she wasn't prepared to ask. Outside, the voices grew closer still, and Margaret realized with growing certainty that whatever was approaching her cabin, it was coming with purpose. This was not a random encounter, not a chance meeting in the wilderness. Someone or something had sought her out in the midst of one of the worst storms she had ever witnessed. As she waited in the flickering light of her fire, listening to the approach of the unknown, Margaret Sullivan prepared to face whatever test the Montana winter had delivered to her door. The drumming stopped. In the sudden absence of that rhythmic pounding, the storm's fury seemed magnified tenfold. Margaret pressed herself against the cabin wall, rifle clutched to her chest, straining to hear anything beyond the wind's relentless assault. The silence stretched on, broken only by the crack of ice-laden branches and the whistle of air through gaps in the logs she had never noticed before. Then came a sound that froze her blood, a human cry, raw and desperate, cutting through the blizzard like a blade. It rose and fell, carried on the wind, a voice calling out in obvious distress. Margaret's grip tightened on her weapon as she recognized the unmistakable tone of someone in mortal pain. The cry came again, weaker this time, from somewhere near the corral where her horses were sheltered. Against every instinct screaming at her to remain hidden, Margaret found herself moving toward the door. She had spent too many years as a healer's daughter, too many seasons caring for her own family's injuries, to ignore the sound of genuine suffering. She cracked open the heavy wooden door, and the storm immediately tried to force its way inside. Snow whirled around her boots as she peered into the chaos beyond her porch. The cold hit her face like a physical blow, stealing her breath and bringing tears to her eyes that froze almost instantly on her cheeks. At first, she saw nothing but swirling white madness. Then lightning strange and unnatural in a snowstorm split the sky, illuminating the scene before her cabin. What she saw made her gasp and stumble backward. A massive figure lay crumpled in the snow near her fence, barely visible beneath a growing blanket of white. Even from a distance, she could see it was a man of extraordinary size. His long black hair spread around his head like spilled ink. Dark stains in the snow around him spoke of blood, and Margaret realized with stark clarity that this was no ordinary traveler caught in the storm. The Apache warrior, for that's clearly what he was. Despite being far from any territory she knew, his people to claim wore traditional clothing mixed with items clearly taken from white settlements. A beaded vest over a wool shirt, leather leggings reinforced with canvas patches, and around his neck, a silver chain that caught the strange lightning's glow. His horse, a magnificent paint stallion, stood nearby with its head lowered against the wind, refusing to abandon its fallen rider. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Margaret faced a choice that would define everything that followed. She could bar her door, wait out the storm, and deal with whatever remained when morning came. Or she could step into the blizzard and try to save the life of a man whose people were often painted as her enemies by every newspaper and territorial governor from here to Washington. The decision, when it came, surprised her with its swiftness. Thomas had always said she possessed too much compassion for her own good, and Emma had inherited that same inability to ignore suffering wherever it appeared. Margaret set down her rifle and reached for her heaviest coat. The journey from her porch to the fallen warrior became an epic in itself. The wind tried to lift her from her feet with every step, and the snow was already deep enough to reach her knees. She fought forward, guided more by instinct than sight, until she reached the dark shape that barely resembled a human being anymore. Up close, the Apache's injuries were severe, but not immediately fatal. A gash across his forehead bled freely, and his left arm hung at an unnatural angle that spoke of a broken bone. But it was the way he breathed, shallow, rattling gasps that spoke of internal damage, that worried Margaret most. He needed shelter, warmth, and medical attention beyond anything she could provide in the middle of a blizzard. The warrior's eyes opened as she knelt beside him, dark depths that held no fear despite his obvious pain. He spoke words in his own language that meant nothing to her but were clearly urgent. His uninjured hand gripped her wrist with surprising strength, and Margaret found herself looking into a face that spoke of leadership and authority. Even in extremity, she had no way to communicate with him directly, but needed no translation. Margaret managed to get her shoulder under his good arm and began the exhausting process of helping him to his feet. He was easily twice her weight and several inches taller than any man she had ever encountered, making progress toward the cabin a matter of inches rather than steps. The paint horse followed them, its intelligence evident in the way it positioned itself to block some of the wind from its injured master. Margaret had always possessed an affinity for animals, and she found herself grateful for the stallion's assistance as they struggled through the deepening snow, getting the wounded Apache inside her cabin required removing the door entirely from its hinges, the only way to accommodate his broad shoulders and long limbs. By the time she had him positioned near the fire, Margaret was exhausted, soaked through, and beginning to realize the full magnitude of what she had committed herself to. The warrior was unconscious again, his breathing more labored than before. Margaret had learned basic medical skills from her mother, who had served as the closest thing to a doctor their settlement possessed, but those skills had never been tested on injuries this severe. She began with the most obvious problems, cleaning and bandaging the head wound, fashioning a crude splint for his arm, checking for signs of internal bleeding that might prove beyond her ability to treat as she worked. She studied his face. In the firelight, this was not a young man. Silver threaded through his black hair, and lines around his eyes spoke of years spent squinting into harsh sunlight and harder winds. Scars marked his hands and arms, some clearly from battles, others from the countless small injuries that came with a life lived outdoors. Around his neck, beside the silver chain, hung a leather cord strung with beads and what appeared to be carved bone symbols of rank or spiritual significance. She couldn't interpret. His clothing told stories she wished she could read. The vest was masterwork, beaded in patterns that spoke of countless hours of skilled labor. The silver chain held a medallion she didn't recognize, not military, not religious in any Christian sense, but clearly important. His weapons, a rifle and a knife with an elaborately carved handle, lay where they had fallen in the snow outside. As the hours passed and the storm showed no signs of abating, Margaret found herself in the strange position of sharing her cabin with a man who represented everything the territorial newspapers warned against. Yet lying there unconscious, struggling with fever and pain, he seemed less like a terrifying savage and more like any human being reduced to the most basic need for compassion. She prepared broth from the last of her chicken stock, knowing he would need nourishment when consciousness returned. The process of cooking gave her hands something to do while her mind wrestled with the implications of her choice. By morning, assuming both of them survived the night, she would be harboring an Apache warrior in her home. The territorial authorities would view this as treason. Her neighbors, few though they were, would consider it madness, but as Margaret watched his chest rise and fall in the firelight, she knew she would make the same choice again. Thomas had always said that civilization was measured not by laws or weapons, but by how people treated those who were completely at their mercy. Tonight, she would discover what kind of person 3 years of solitude had made her. The warrior stirred as midnight approached, his eyes opening to focus on her face with startling clarity. For a long moment, They simply looked at each other, the Apache chief and the white woman who had risked everything to pull him from the storm. When he spoke, his voice was deeper than she had expected, roughened by pain but carrying unmistakable authority. "Why?" he asked in English, the single word hanging between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm. Margaret considered her answer carefully, knowing that everything that followed might depend on her next words. "Because you needed help," she said simply, "and because it was the right thing to do." The Apache's eyes never left her face as he absorbed this response. Then, slowly, he nodded a gesture that seemed to carry the weight of treaty negotiations and formal diplomacy, despite their humble surroundings. "I am Chief Running Bear of the Jicarilla Apache," he said, each word measured and deliberate. "And I am in your debt, white woman. What is your name?" "Margaret Sullivan," she replied, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "This is my home, such as it is." Chief Running Bear attempted to sit up, wincing at the pain from his injuries, but succeeding in propping himself against the cabin wall. His eyes took in every detail of the room, the rifle above the fireplace, the simple furnishings, the photographs of her family on the mantelpiece, the medical supplies she had used to treat his wounds. "You live alone," he observed, making it a statement rather than a question. "Yes," Margaret confirmed, offering him the cup of broth she had prepared. "My husband and daughter died 3 years ago. I came here to ... She paused, searching for words to explain her self-imposed exile. "To heal," Chief Running Bear finished for her, accepting the broth with his good hand. "The land can teach us how to carry grief, if we let it." The simple wisdom in his words brought unexpected tears to Margaret's eyes. In 3 years of solitude, no one had understood so quickly why she had chosen this harsh existence over the comfortable sympathy of distant relatives. As the storm raged outside, Chief Running Bear told her of the hunting party that had brought him so far from his usual territory. They had been tracking a rogue band of Comancheros traders who sold weapons to hostile tribes while claiming to work for peace. The trail had led them north into an unfamiliar country just as the blizzard struck. "My warriors will come for me," he said with absolute certainty. "When the storm ends, they will follow my trail here, protective of their chief." Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "Will I be safe when they arrive?" Chief Running Bear studied her face in the firelight before answering. "That depends," he said slowly, "on what I tell them about the white woman who saved my life." Dawn came reluctantly, seeping through the frost-covered window like pale honey. The storm had finally exhausted itself sometime before sunrise, leaving behind a world transformed into crystalline silence. Margaret stirred from her uneasy sleep in the wooden chair beside the fire, her neck stiff and her back protesting the night spent in an upright position. She had been unwilling to leave Chief Running Bear unattended, fearful that his injuries might worsen while she slept. The Apache leader was awake when she opened her eyes, his dark gaze fixed on the ceiling. Beams above him. In the morning light filtering through the window, Margaret could see details that the firelight had obscured. His face bore the weathered marks of a man who had spent decades under harsh skies, but there was a nobility to his features that spoke of generations of leadership. The silver medallion at his throat caught the light, revealing intricate engravings that seemed to tell stories in symbols she couldn't decipher. "The storm has passed," he said without looking at her, his voice stronger than it had been the night before. Margaret rose carefully, working the stiffness from her joints as she moved to the window. The landscape outside bore no resemblance to the familiar valley she had called home for 3 years. Snow had drifted against the cabin walls nearly to the window sills, and the trees bent under loads of ice that turned every branch into a work of art. Her corral was barely visible beneath the white blanket, though she could make out the dark shapes of her horses moving about, apparently unharmed by their ordeal. "How deep do you think it is?" She asked, more to make conversation than from any real need to know. 3 feet in the open ground, perhaps 5 where it has drifted. Chief Running Bear replied with the confidence of someone accustomed to reading the land's moods. It will take time to melt, even when the sun returns in force. The implication hung between them unspoken. They would be isolated here for days, possibly weeks, depending on how quickly the snow cleared and how soon his warriors could reach them. Margaret felt a flutter of nervousness at the thought of being confined with this imposing man, but it was tempered by the surprising ease of their conversation. She busied herself with morning tasks, building up the fire and preparing a simple breakfast from her limited stores. The routine helped calm her nerves while she considered the practical challenges ahead. Her food supplies, adequate for 1 person through the winter, would be strained feeding 2 people, especially a man of Chief Running Bear's size who was recovering from serious injuries. "You should eat," she said, offering them a bowl of cornmeal. Porridge sweetened with the last of her precious honey. "You've lost blood, and your body needs nourishment to heal." He accepted the food with a formal nod that reminded her of his rank and dignity, even in these reduced circumstances. As he ate, Margaret tended to his injuries, changing the bandages on his head wound and checking the splint on his arm. The bleeding had stopped, and while his skin was warm to the touch, it didn't have the burning heat of dangerous fever. "You have some knowledge of healing," he observed as she worked. "This is not the clumsy binding of someone ignorant of medicine." "My mother was our settlement's healer," Margaret explained, carefully cleaning around the edges of his head wound. "She taught me what she could before she died. I never imagined I would use those skills to treat." She paused, unsure how to finish the sentence without giving offense. To treat an Apache warrior? Chief Running Bear supplied with what might have been amusement. "Your people and mine have shed each other's blood for many seasons. Yet here you are, binding my wounds with gentle hands." Margaret met his eyes directly. "I don't see an Apache warrior when I look at you now. I see a man who was hurt and needed help. That's all that matters." Something shifted in his expression, a softening around the eyes that suggested her words had touched something deeper than mere gratitude. "You are not what I expected to find in this wilderness, Margaret Sullivan." The use of her name, spoken with careful pronunciation in his deep voice, sent an unexpected warmth through her chest. She had grown so accustomed to solitude that hearing another person speak her name felt almost intimate. As the day progressed, Chief Running Bear proved to be a patient that defied her expectations. Despite obvious pain from his injuries, he made no complaints and followed her medical instructions without question. More surprising still, he began to share stories of his travels, speaking of landscapes and peoples that existed far beyond her limited experience. The Jicarilla territory extends from the sacred mountains in the south to the Great Plains where the buffalo once ran in numbers beyond counting, he told her as she prepared their midday meal. "We are traders and hunters, not raiders like some of the southern bands. My people have always sought to walk in harmony with the land rather than conquer it." Margaret found herself drawn into his descriptions of a way of life completely different from anything she had known. He spoke of seasonal migrations following ancient patterns, of ceremonies that marked the turning of the year, of a complex social structure that valued wisdom and experience above mere wealth. "Do you have a family?" she asked, immediately regretting the personal nature of the question. Chief Running Bear was quiet for a long moment before answering. "I had a wife once. She died bringing our son into the world, and the child lived only 3 days. That was many winters ago, when I was young and believed the spirits owed me happiness." The pain in his voice was unmistakable, and Margaret felt a kinship with this man who had also known the devastation of losing those he loved most. "I'm sorry," she said simply. "The loss of a child. There are no words adequate to that grief." "You speak as one who knows," he replied, his eyes finding hers across the small cabin. "My daughter Emma was 7 when the fever took her. Margaret said, the words coming easier than they had in years. My husband followed her 3 days later. I couldn't stay in the place where they had lived and laughed. Everything there reminded me of voices I would never hear again. Chief Running Bear nodded slowly. So you came here to make peace with ghosts. The land can teach us to carry the dead without letting them drag us down to join them. His understanding was so complete, so immediate, that Margaret felt tears prick at her eyes. In 3 years of solitude, she had spoken to no one about the real reasons for her exile. Even the few neighbors who lived within a day's ride assumed she was simply a widow making the best of difficult circumstances, not a woman fleeing from memories too painful to bear. That afternoon, Chief Running Bear insisted on attempting to stand, despite Margaret's protests about his injuries. With her reluctant assistance, he managed to rise to his feet, though he swayed dangerously and had to brace himself against the cabin wall. The effort left him pale and breathing heavily, but there was satisfaction in his eyes at having accomplished even this small victory. My warriors will expect to find their chief on his feet when they arrive, he explained. I cannot appear weak before them, not if I hope to protect you from their enthusiasm. The reminder of the approaching war party sent a chill through Margaret that had nothing to do with the cold air seeping through the cabin's chinks. Will they really try to hurt me? Chief Running Bear considered his answer carefully. My men are loyal and fierce in battle, but they are also young and hot-blooded. They will see a white woman who has touched their chief's body, who has seen him weak and wounded. Some will view this as dishonor that must be answered. And what will you tell them? The truth, he said simply, that you saved my life when you could have left me to die, that you tended my wounds with skill and kindness, that you fed me from your own stores when you had little to spare. He paused, studying her face. Whether they choose to see honor or dishonor in these actions will depend on how I present the story. Margaret felt the weight of her future resting on this man's words and reputation among his own people. It was a terrifying thought, but also strangely comforting to know that her fate would be decided by someone who had already shown her courtesy and respect. As evening approached, Chief Running Bear grew restless, moving carefully to the window to study the snow-covered landscape. His paint stallion had found shelter in the lee of the cabin and seemed content to wait out the cold, but Margaret could see the chief's anxiety about his missing warriors. How long before they find you? She asked. 2 days, perhaps 3. He replied. Stormwalker, my lieutenant, is the finest tracker among the Jicarilla. The snow will slow him, but it will not stop him. That night, Margaret prepared a more substantial meal from her stores, using some of her carefully hoarded bacon and the last of her potatoes. Chief Running Bear watched her work with obvious appreciation for her domestic skills, occasionally offering suggestions about herbs and seasonings that his people use to enhance simple ingredients. You cook as my grandmother did, he said as they shared the meal. She believed that food prepared with care could heal both body and spirit. Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman. She raised me after my parents died in a cavalry raid. When I was still young, everything I know about leadership, about balancing justice with mercy, I learned at her feet. His voice carried a reverence that spoke of deep love and respect. She lived to see me become chief, but I think she would be surprised to find me sharing a meal with a white woman who has shown me such kindness. Margaret found herself wondering what this remarkable grandmother would have thought of the present situation. Would she have approved of her grandson accepting help from someone whose people had killed his parents? Or would she have seen, as Chief Running Bear seemed to, that compassion could bridge even the deepest cultural divides? As they talked into the evening, Margaret discovered that Chief Running Bear possessed a sophisticated understanding of the political forces shaping the territory. He spoke knowledgeably about government policies, about the economic pressures driving westward expansion, and about the impossible position his people found themselves in as their traditional lands disappeared. Beneath a tide of settlers. "The old ways are dying," he said with evident sadness. "My father's generation could still remember when the Apache controlled vast territories, when we could follow the seasonal rounds without encountering white settlements. Now we are pressed into smaller and smaller areas, forced to adapt or be destroyed. Is there no hope for peace?" Margaret asked. Chief Running Bear was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. "There might be, if enough people on both sides were willing to see past old hatreds. But peace requires more than good intentions. It requires understanding, compromise, and the wisdom to know when forgiveness serves justice better than revenge." Margaret thought about his words as she prepared for another night of watching over her unusual patient. The conversation had revealed depths to this man that challenged every assumption she had held about his people. He was not the savage portrayed in territorial newspapers, but a thoughtful leader grappling with impossible choices in a rapidly changing world. As she settled into her chair beside the fire, Chief Running Bear spoke from his position on the floor near the hearth. "Margaret Sullivan," he said, using her full name with that same careful pronunciation. "When my warriors arrive, they will expect explanations for what they find here. I will tell them that you are under my protection, that any harm done to you would be an insult to my honor. But you should know that once I give you that protection, you will be bound to me and my people in ways you may not understand." Margaret felt her heart skip at the implications in his words. "What do you mean?" "Among the Apache, when someone saves a chief's life, especially in the way you have done, it creates obligations that go beyond simple gratitude. My people will see you as connected to me, to our tribe, in permanent ways." The fire crackled in the silence that followed his explanation, and Margaret found herself staring into the flames as she considered what he was telling her. Tomorrow or the next day, warriors would arrive expecting to find their chief. What they would actually find was a situation that defied easy explanation, one that might require solutions neither she nor Chief Running Bear had yet imagined. "Sleep now," he said gently, perhaps sensing her troubled thoughts. "Tomorrow we will face whatever comes together." But sleep proved elusive for Margaret that night. As she sat watching over Chief Running Bear, listening to the soft sound of his breathing and the occasional pop of settling logs in the fire, she found herself wondering if her solitary life was about to end in ways she had never anticipated. The choices she had made in the storm seemed simple enough at the time. See suffering, provide aid, ask no questions about the consequences. Now, as she waited for Apache warriors to appear at her door, Margaret realized that compassion, once unleashed, had a way of demanding more from a person than they ever intended to give. The third morning brought with it a crystalline clarity that hurt to look upon. Every surface outside the cabin gleamed with ice, and the snow had hardened into a crust that would bear a person's weight in some places, while swallowing them to the waist in others. Margaret stood at her window, coffee cup warming her hands, watching the paint stallion paw through the snow to reach the dried grass beneath. The animal's persistence reminded her that survival often required patience and determination in equal measure. Chief Running Bear had insisted on dressing himself that morning, though the effort clearly cost him. He moved with careful deliberation, favoring his injured arm while maintaining the upright bearing that marked him as a leader. Margaret had offered assistance, but he had declined with polite firmness, explaining that his warriors must see him as strong and capable when they arrived. "Today," he said with absolute certainty as he settled himself near the window where he could watch the approaches to the cabin, "Storm Walker will find the trail before the sun reaches its peak." Margaret felt her stomach tighten with nervous anticipation. The past 2 days had created an odd intimacy between them, born of necessity but deepened by shared confidences and mutual respect. Soon that bubble of isolation would be broken by the arrival of armed men who might view her presence as anything from curiosity to threat. "Tell me about Stormwalker," she said, hoping that understanding the man who led Chief Running Bear's warriors might help her navigate the approaching encounter. The chief's weathered features softened slightly at the mention of his lieutenant's name. "He's like a son to me, though no blood connects us. His parents died in a cholera outbreak when he was barely old enough to walk. My wife and I took him in, raised him as our own." Pain flickered across his face at the mention of his deceased family. "When my wife died and I lost our child, Stormwalker became my anchor to the living world. He is fierce in battle, wise in counsel, and absolutely loyal to his people." "And to you," Margaret observed. "Perhaps too much so," Chief Running Bear admitted. "His devotion sometimes blinds him to complexities that require more subtle handling. When he sees that I have been injured, when he finds me in the home of a white woman, his first instinct will be to assume the worst and respond accordingly." Margaret set down her coffee cup with hands that trembled slightly. "What exactly does that mean for me?" "It means that the first words spoken when they arrive will determine whether you live or die," Chief Running Bear said with stark honesty. "Stormwalker and the others will be prepared for battle, expecting to find enemies to punish for my disappearance. If they perceive you as a threat or as someone who has dishonored their chief, they will act swiftly." The weight of her situation settled over Margaret like a heavy blanket. She had spent 3 years in self-imposed isolation, speaking to perhaps a dozen people in all that time, and now her life depended on a conversation with Apache warriors who had every reason to distrust her. "What should I do when they arrive?" she asked. Chief Running Bear considered the question carefully. "Stay inside until I call for you. Let me speak to them first. Establish the situation in their minds before they see you. When you do come out, move slowly, keep your hands visible, and show no fear." Apache warriors respect courage, even in their enemies. As if summoned by their conversation, the paint stallion suddenly raised its head, ears pricked forward, looking toward the eastern ridge. Chief Running Bear tensed, his hand moving instinctively toward where his weapons would normally rest at his side. "They come," he said simply. Margaret's heart began to pound as she moved to the window beside him. At first, she saw nothing but the glittering expanse of snow-covered wilderness. Then, like shadows materializing from the landscape itself, dark figures appeared on the ridge. Even at a distance, there was something distinctly menacing about their approach, the way they moved in perfect formation, the careful spacing that spoke of tactical awareness, the predatory stillness with which they paused to survey the valley below. "How many?" Margaret whispered. 8, Chief Running Bear replied after a moment's observation. "Stormwalker, plus 7 others, a full war party." The warriors began their descent into the valley, and Margaret could see them more clearly now. They rode with the easy grace of men born to the saddle, their horses picking their way through the treacherous snow with sure-footed confidence. Each warrior carried a rifle across his lap, and she could make out the shapes of bows and quivers strapped to their backs. War paint marked their faces in patterns she couldn't interpret, and their hair was bound with strips of cloth and feathers that caught the morning light. At their head rode a young man who could only be Stormwalker. Even from a distance, his bearing marked him as second in command. He was smaller than Chief Running Bear, but moved with a coiled energy that spoke of dangerous competence. As the war party drew closer, Margaret could see that his face was painted with slashes of black and red that made his dark eyes appear to burn with inner fire. "He looks angry," Margaret observed. "He has been searching for 3 days in weather." "That would kill lesser men," Chief Running Bear replied. "He is angry, worried, and prepared for the worst. The combination makes him extremely dangerous." The war party reached the valley floor and spread out in a semicircle around the cabin, their horses stamping and snorting in the cold air. Storm Walker dismounted and approached the cabin door with the fluid grace of a predator, his rifle held ready but not quite aimed. The other warriors remained mounted, their weapons trained on the cabin's windows and the surrounding area. Chief Running Bear rose carefully from his position by the window, straightening to his full impressive height despite the obvious pain the movement caused. He moved to the door and opened it before Stormwalker could reach the porch, stepping outside in full view of his men. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Stormwalker stopped dead in his tracks, his weapon lowering as he took in the sight of his chief standing upright and apparently unharmed. A rapid exchange in Apache followed, Stormwalker's voice rising with what sounded like a mixture of relief and anger, while Chief Running Bear responded in measured, authoritative tones. Margaret couldn't understand the words, but the emotional content was clear enough. Stormwalker was demanding explanations while Chief Running Bear was providing them in the tone of a leader who expected to be obeyed without question. Other voices joined the conversation as the mounted warriors called out questions and comments, their relief at finding their chief alive evident even across the language barrier. The discussion went on for several minutes, with Stormwalker's body language gradually shifting from aggressive alertness to confused attention. Margaret caught her name mentioned several times, along with words that sounded important even though she couldn't interpret them. At one point, Stormwalker gestured sharply toward the cabin, and Chief Running Bear's response was sharp enough to make the younger man step back. Finally, Chief Running Bear called out in English, "Margaret, please come outside. Move slowly and keep your hands where they can see them." Stormwalker's expression darkened. "There will be challenges," he admitted. "Not all of our people have reason to love the white race. Some have lost family to cavalry raids or disease brought by settlers. They may see your presence as problematic. But," Chief Running Bear interjected firmly, "you will be under my personal protection. Any who would harm you would answer me directly. In our society, a chief's word on such matters is absolute." Margaret found herself thinking of the life she would be leaving behind, the cabin Thomas had built with such hope, the photographs of her family, the carefully tended grave markers in the small plot behind the house. Everything that connected her to her past would be abandoned if she made this choice. May I gather some belongings?" she asked, hating how small and uncertain her voice sounded. Quickly, Stormwalker replied, though his tone had softened slightly. "Take only what you can carry easily. We travel light and fast." Margaret nodded and turned toward her cabin door, then paused. "Chief Running Bear, when we spoke of obligations and consequences, you mentioned that I would become. What exactly am I to you, to your people?" The Apache leader's weathered features revealed nothing of his thoughts as he considered his answer. "Among the Jicarilla, relationships are complex things with many layers. You saved my life when you could have left me to die. This creates a bond that goes beyond simple gratitude. You will be under my protection, part of my household, connected to me and through me to the tribe, but not." Margaret struggled to find the words for what she was asking. Not as a wife? Something that might have been amusement flickered in Chief Running Bear's dark eyes. "That would depend on many factors, your wishes, the customs of both our peoples, the approval of the tribal elders. For now, you would be simply what you are, a woman who showed kindness to an enemy and must live with the consequences." The answer was both reassuring and terrifying in its ambiguity. Margaret turned and entered her cabin, knowing that she had perhaps 10 minutes to gather the remnants of her old life before beginning a journey into the unknown. Inside the familiar walls that had sheltered her for 3 years, Margaret moved with desperate efficiency. She pulled her traveling bag from beneath the bed and began filling it with practical necessities, extra clothing suitable for winter travel, her medical supplies, the few personal items that connected her to happier times. Her fingers lingered over the small Bible Thomas had given her on their wedding day, its leather cover worn smooth by countless readings. She tucked it carefully into the bag along with a daguerreotype of her family taken just months before the fever claimed them. The Photographs on the mantelpiece seemed to watch her as she moved about the cabin, and Margaret felt tears prick at her eyes. How could she explain to Thomas and Emma's memory that she was abandoning the life they had built together to follow Apache warriors into the wilderness? Yet as she looked at their faces captured in fading silver, she thought she saw something, like understanding in their expressions. From outside came the sound of horses moving restlessly and men speaking in low, urgent tones. Margaret added her warmest cloak to her belongings and took one last look around the cabin that had been both sanctuary and prison. The fire was dying in the hearth, and already the room felt different, not like a home, but like a place someone had once lived. She emerged from the cabin to find the warriors mounted and ready to depart. Chief Running Bear sat his paint stallion with obvious difficulty, but his posture radiated authority and determination. Storm Walker had brought an extra horse, a sturdy bay mare that looked capable of carrying her through the challenging terrain ahead. "This is Moon Feather," Chief Running Bear said, indicating the mare. "She has carried women of our tribe for many seasons. She will serve you well if you treat her with respect." Margaret approached the horse slowly, extending her hand for the animal to sniff. Moon Feather regarded her with intelligent brown eyes before allowing Margaret to stroke her neck. The mare's acceptance felt like a small omen of hope in a situation filled with uncertainty. "Can you ride?" Storm Walker asked, though his tone suggested he was prepared to deal with the situation either way. "Yes," Margaret replied. "My father insisted I learn when I was young. He said a woman who couldn't manage a horse was a woman who couldn't escape danger." She accepted Storm Walker's assistance in mounting, settling herself in the unfamiliar saddle with as much grace as she could manage. The bag containing her possessions was secured behind her, a pitiful collection of items to represent an entire life. As the war party prepared to depart, Margaret took one final look at her cabin. The structure appeared solid and permanent against the backdrop of snow-covered mountains, but she knew that by spring it would be nothing more than an empty shell slowly returning to the wilderness. Already, snow was beginning to drift against the door she had left unlocked. Chief Running Bear guided his horse to her side, his voice gentle as he spoke. "Second thoughts are natural, Margaret Sullivan. But the choice has been made, and dwelling on what might have been serves no purpose. The path ahead may be difficult, but it leads to life rather than slow death in solitude." The war party began to move, and Margaret found herself part of a column of riders threading their way through snow-covered terrain with the fluid precision of men who had been born to this life. Storm Walker took the lead, his sharp eyes constantly scanning the landscape for signs of danger, while two warriors rode behind as rear guard. The formation spoke of military discipline and hard-won experience. As they climbed out of the valley that had been her home, Margaret turned for one last glimpse of the cabin. From this distance, it looked impossibly small and vulnerable, a fragile human mark on an indifferent landscape. She wondered if she would ever see it again, and realized with surprise that the thought brought more relief than sadness. The journey that followed tested every aspect of Margaret's endurance and adaptability. The warriors set a pace that was challenging but not impossible, stopping frequently to rest the horses and check for signs of pursuit or hostile activity. They traveled in near complete silence, communicating through hand signals and subtle changes in formation that spoke of years of practice. During their first rest stop, Storm Walker approached Margaret with obvious reluctance. His painted face made reading his expression difficult, but his body language suggested internal conflict. "White woman," he began, then seemed to reconsider his words. "Margaret Sullivan, I must speak plainly with you about what lies ahead." Margaret dismounted from Moon Feather and stretched her aching legs, grateful for the brief respite. "I'm listening. Our chief is a good man, an honorable leader who has guided our people through many difficult seasons. But his protection alone may not be enough to ensure your safety among the Jicarilla." Stormwalker glanced toward Chief Running Bear, who was examining his injured arm with careful attention. There are those who will see your presence as weakness on his part, a compromise of traditional values that could threaten his authority. Are you saying I'm putting him in danger by accepting his protection? Stormwalker nodded gravely. Politics among our people can be complex. Chief Running Bear has enemies within the tribe who would use any excuse to challenge his leadership. A white woman under his protection could provide them with the opportunity they have been seeking. Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Then perhaps I should ... No, Stormwalker interrupted firmly. The choice has been made, the words have been spoken. To turn back now would dishonor both you and our chief. But you must understand the gravity of your situation. Your survival depends not just on adapting to our ways, but on proving your worth to people who have every reason to hate what you represent. The weight of responsibility settled over Margaret like a heavy blanket. She had thought her decision would affect only her own life, but apparently she had stumbled into tribal politics that could have far-reaching consequences for Chief Running Bear and his people. What can I do to help rather than hinder? She asked. Stormwalker studied her face with the intensity of a man evaluating a potential enemy. Learn quickly, work hard, and show respect for our customs even when they seem strange to you. Prove that you are more than just another white settler seeking to take what belongs to others. As they resumed their journey, Margaret found herself riding alongside different warriors, each of whom seemed to be conducting his own evaluation of their unexpected traveling companion. Some ignored her completely, while others watched her with barely concealed suspicion. A few showed what might have been curiosity, though they made no attempt at conversation. The landscape through which they traveled was harsh, but breathtakingly beautiful. Snow-covered peaks rose on all sides, their slopes painted in shades of white and gray that shifted constantly as clouds moved across the sun. Dense forests of pine and aspen provided shelter from the wind, while open meadows offered expansive views of territory that seemed to stretch forever. As the day progressed, Margaret began to appreciate the skill with which the warriors navigated this challenging terrain. They found paths where none seemed to exist, identified safe camping spots with glances that revealed years of experience, and moved through potential ambush points with tactical awareness that spoke of hard-won survival skills. During their midday rest, Chief Running Bear made his way to where Margaret sat attempting to restore feeling to her frozen hands. Despite his injuries, he moved with the fluid grace of a man completely at home in the wilderness. You ride well for someone unaccustomed to such travel, he observed, settling himself on a snow-covered log beside her resting place. I'm trying not to slow everyone down, Margaret replied, though I suspect your men would prefer to travel much faster without me. Chief Running Bear followed her gaze to where Stormwalker was consulting with the other warriors, their voices too low to overhear, but their body language suggesting serious discussion. Stormwalker worries about many things, he said diplomatically. It is his nature to see danger in every shadow and threat, in every change to established routine. But his concerns are not without merit. Bringing you among our people will create adjustments that some may find difficult to accept. Margaret turned to study his weathered profile, noting the lines of pain around his eyes that spoke of injuries still healing. Are you having second thoughts about this decision? No, Chief Running Bear replied without hesitation. The spirits brought you to my aid for reasons we may not fully understand yet, but I would be foolish to ignore the practical challenges ahead. He paused, his dark eyes finding hers. You will face tests in our village that will require all your strength and wisdom. Some will be official trials to determine your place among us. Others will be personal challenges from individuals who see you as a threat to their way of life. And if I fail these tests, Chief Running Bear's expression remained neutral, but Margaret caught something in his tone that might have been regret. Then we will deal with that situation when it arises. but I believe you have reserves of strength you have not yet discovered. The woman who chose to save an enemy's life in the middle of a blizzard is not someone who gives up easily. As afternoon faded toward evening, the war party began looking for a suitable camping spot. Stormwalker eventually selected a sheltered grove of pine trees that provided protection from the wind while offering multiple escape routes if danger threatened. The efficiency with which the warriors established their camp impressed Margaret. Within minutes, they had created a defensible position complete with concealed fire pit and carefully positioned sentries. Margaret found herself assigned specific tasks that tested both her practical skills and her willingness to follow orders without question. She was expected to help gather firewood, assist with the preparation of their simple meal, and maintain the horses during their rest period. Each task was performed under the watchful eyes of warriors who seemed to be evaluating her competence and attitude. As darkness fell and the temperature plummeted, the war party gathered around their small fire for a meal of dried meat and parched corn. The food was simple but nourishing, and Margaret was grateful for the warmth it provided against the bitter cold. Conversation was minimal, conducted mostly in Apache with occasional translations for her benefit. It was during this quiet meal that Margaret first heard mention of their destination. Chief Running Bear spoke a word that sounded like Dulcie, and Stormwalker responded with what seemed to be questions about timing and weather conditions. When she asked for clarification, Chief Running Bear explained that Dulcie was the name of their winter village, located in a protected valley several days' ride from their current position. It is where our people gather during the cold months, he explained. The location is sacred to the Jicarilla, chosen by our ancestors for its natural defenses and abundant resources. You will find it different from any white settlement you have known. As the evening progressed and the warriors settled into their sleeping arrangements, Margaret realized with growing anxiety that she was about to enter a world completely alien to everything she had ever experienced. The village of Dulcie represented not just a change of residence, but a fundamental transformation of her identity and purpose. Walker approached her as she prepared her bedroll in the space designated for her use. His painted face was barely visible in the dying firelight, but his voice carried a gravity that made her pay careful attention. Tomorrow we enter territory that belongs completely to the Jicarilla, he said quietly. Beyond that point, there can be no turning back, no changing of minds, no appeals to white authorities for rescue or protection. Are you certain you understand what you are choosing? Margaret looked around at the sleeping forms of the warriors, men who had accepted her presence, but might never truly accept her as one of their own. In the distance, coyotes called to each other across the frozen landscape, their voices carrying a wildness that spoke of worlds beyond human understanding. I understand that I have no other choice, she replied honestly. And I understand that my survival depends on proving myself worthy of the protection I've been offered. Stormwalker nodded slowly, his expression revealing nothing of his thoughts. Then sleep well, Margaret Sullivan. Tomorrow you begin the most difficult journey of your life. As Margaret lay wrapped in her blankets, listening to the wind whisper through the pine trees and the soft sounds of the camp settling into sleep, she found herself thinking of the series of choices that had brought her to this moment. Each decision had seemed reasonable at the time: staying in the cabin during the storm, helping an injured man, accepting protection when it was offered. Yet somehow those simple choices had led her to this frozen wilderness, surrounded by Apache warriors and traveling toward a future she couldn't even imagine. Above her, stars pierced the clear mountain air with crystalline intensity, and Margaret wondered if Thomas and Emma could see her from whatever realm they now inhabited. Would they understand the path she was taking? Would they approve of her decision to embrace life, however uncertain, rather than continue her slow retreat from the world? As sleep finally claimed her, Margaret's last conscious thought was a prayer, not for rescue or return to her former life, but for the strength and wisdom to face whatever tests awaited her in the Apache village of Dulce. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new people to win over or defend against, and new aspects of herself she would be forced to discover. Wind carried her dreams toward distant mountains, toward a future as uncharted as the territory through which they traveled, toward a destiny that had begun with a simple act of compassion and would end in ways she could not yet foresee. The morning of their third day brought with it a transformation in the landscape that Margaret could sense before she could see. The quality of light changed subtly, taking on a golden warmth that spoke of protected valleys and sheltered places. The wind, which had been a constant companion throughout their journey, seemed to soften and change direction, carrying scents that suggested human habitation, wood smoke, cooking fires, and the complex aromas of a settled community. Stormwalker called for an extended rest as they crested a ridge that overlooked their destination. Margaret urged Moonfather forward until she could see what lay below, and the sight took her breath away in ways she hadn't expected. The village of Dulce nestled in a circular valley surrounded by towering cliffs that provided natural protection from both weather and enemies. Smoke rose from perhaps 60 dwellings arranged in careful patterns that spoke of ancient tradition and practical wisdom. Some structures were the familiar tipis she had seen in illustrations, but others were more permanent buildings constructed from stone and timber that suggested the Jicarilla had adapted their architecture to local conditions and materials. What struck Margaret most forcefully was the sense of harmony between human settlement and natural landscape. The village seemed to have grown from the valley floor rather than being imposed upon it, with paths following natural contours and buildings positioned to take advantage of shelter and drainage. Gardens and storage areas were integrated seamlessly into the overall design, creating a community that felt both purposeful and organic. "It's beautiful," she whispered, forgetting for a moment that her words might be overheard. Chief Running Bear guided his horse to her side, his weathered face showing something that might have been pride mixed with deep affection. "My ancestors chose this place 7 generations ago, when the Spanish first came to our lands. The cliffs provide protection, the springs never run dry, and the soil supports crops that help us survive the harsh winters." Margaret could see why the location had been chosen. The valley floor was broad enough to support a substantial population, while the surrounding heights offered defensive advantages that would make the village nearly impregnable to conventional attack. Natural caves visible in the cliff faces suggested additional storage and shelter options, while patches of cultivated ground spoke of agricultural knowledge that challenged the stereotypes she had carried about nomadic peoples. "How many people live here?" she asked. "During winter, perhaps 300 souls," Stormwalker replied, his tone carrying a mixture of reverence and protective concern. "Families from across our territory gather here when the snow make travel dangerous. In spring, many will disperse to follow traditional hunting and gathering patterns, but this place remains the heart of our people." Margaret felt her stomach tighten as she contemplated entering a community of 300 Apache, most of whom would have no context for understanding her presence beyond the fact that she was white and therefore potentially dangerous. The sheer number of people she would need to win over, or at least convince to tolerate her, seemed overwhelming. As if reading her thoughts, Chief Running Bear spoke quietly. "You must understand that news of our arrival will spread quickly through the village. By the time we reach my lodge, everyone will know that their chief has returned with an unexpected companion. The reactions will be varied." "What should I expect?" Margaret asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "Curiosity, suspicion, fear, anger," Stormwalker enumerated with clinical precision. "Some will see you as a spy sent to gather information for the cavalry. Others will view your presence as a sign that their chief has been bewitched or compromised. A few may simply be confused about why any white woman would choose to live among the Apache. And some, Chief Running Bear added more gently, may be willing to judge you by your actions rather than your ancestry. But those voices may be quiet at first, until they see how you conduct yourself among us. The war party began its descent into the valley, following a path that switched back and forth down the cliff face with engineering skill that impressed Margaret despite her anxiety. As they descended, she could see more details of the village below. Children played in open areas between the lodges, their laughter carrying on the thin mountain air. Women moved about their daily tasks, tending fires, working with textiles, and managing the complex logistics of community life. Men could be seen maintaining weapons, caring for horses, and engaged in what appeared to be council meetings or informal discussions. It looked, Margaret realized with surprise, remarkably like any frontier community, busy, purposeful, and focused on the practical challenges of survival and prosperity. The main difference was architectural style and the complete absence of the rigid, geometric patterns that characterized white settlements. As the war party reached the valley floor, Margaret became aware that their arrival was being observed with intense interest. Children stopped their games to stare at the unexpected sight of a white woman riding with their warriors. Women paused in their work to whisper urgently among themselves, their expressions ranging from confusion to outright hostility. Men emerged from lodges and work areas, many reaching casually for weapons while maintaining facades of routine activity. The procession through the village became a gauntlet of scrutiny that tested every ounce of Margaret's composure. She forced herself to sit straight in her saddle, meeting curious or hostile gazes with calm dignity, while resisting the urge to shrink from the intensity of their attention. Some of the stares carried simple curiosity, but others held emotions that made her skin crawl: hatred, suspicion, and calculating assessment that made her feel like prey being evaluated by predators. Stormwalker led them toward the center of the village, where larger lodges suggested the residences of important tribal members. Margaret noticed that the buildings here were more elaborate, decorated with painted designs and adorned with symbols that spoke of status and spiritual significance. It was toward the largest of these structures that Chief Running Bear directed his horse, and Margaret realized with growing nervousness that this must be his personal lodge. The building was impressive by any standard, a substantial structure that combined traditional tipi elements with more permanent architectural features. Painted buffalo hides formed the upper portions, while stone and timber construction created a solid base that spoke of year-round occupation. Poles extending from the peak were decorated with feathers, beads, and other ornaments that caught the afternoon light, creating a display that was both beautiful and intimidating. As they dismounted near the lodge entrance, Margaret became aware that a crowd was gathering. Word of their arrival had indeed spread quickly, and it seemed that half the village was finding excuses to pass by Chief Running Bear's residence. The conversation she couldn't understand buzzed with urgent undertones, and she caught her name mentioned repeatedly in contexts that didn't sound particularly welcoming. "Stay close to me," Chief Running Bear murmured as he helped her down from Moonfeather. "The next few hours will determine how the rest of your time among us unfolds." An elderly woman emerged from the chief's lodge, moving with the dignity and authority of someone accustomed to respect and obedience. Her gray hair was braided with silver ornaments, and her clothing displayed the kind of intricate beadwork that spoke of high status within the community. When her eyes fell on Margaret, they narrowed with an expression that needed no translation. "Grandmother Singing Wolf," Chief Running Bear said formally, using English so Margaret could understand. "I have returned from the hunt with an unexpected addition to our family." The woman's response was rapid-fire Apache that carried tones of incredulity and displeasure. Her gestures toward Margaret left no doubt about her opinion of the situation, and Margaret found herself grateful that she couldn't understand the specific words being used to describe her presence. Chief Running Bear replied in the same language. his voice carrying the authority of someone who expected to be obeyed, but also the respect due to an elder, whose wisdom had earned her voice in tribal affairs. The exchange continued for several minutes, with other community members drawing closer to listen and occasionally adding their own comments to the discussion. Finally, Grandmother Singing Wolf turned to Margaret and spoke in heavily accented, but clear English. "You are the white woman who claims to have saved our chief's life?" "Yes, ma'am," Margaret replied, instinctively using the respectful address she would have offered to any elder in her own culture. Something flickered in the old woman's eyes at Margaret's polite response, but her expression remained stern. "And you expect us to welcome you among us because of this act?" Margaret considered her answer carefully, knowing that the wrong words could doom her before she even had a chance to prove herself. "I expect nothing, Grandmother. I'm grateful for Chief Running Bear's protection, and I hope to earn whatever acceptance your people might be willing to offer." Grandmother Singing Wolf studied Margaret's face with the intensity of someone reading character in bone structure and eye color. The silence stretched uncomfortably while the crowd of onlookers waited to see how this first official challenge would be resolved. "We shall see," the elderly woman said finally. "Actions speak louder than claims, and time reveals all truths. You will stay in the Women's Lodge until the council decides what to do with you." The announcement sent ripples of conversation through the gathered crowd, with reactions ranging from approval to protest. Margaret caught enough of the emotional undertones to realize that assigning her to the Women's Lodge was either a protective measure or a form of house arrest, possibly both. "I will take her there myself," announced a voice from the crowd, and Margaret turned to see a woman approaching who appeared to be roughly her own age. Where Grandmother Singing Wolf radiated authority and suspicion, this newcomer projected curiosity tempered by caution. "This is Bright Moon," Chief Running Bear said, introducing the woman. "She oversees the Women's Lodge and will help you understand our ways during your first days among us." Bright Moon was strikingly beautiful in a way that spoke of mixed heritage, high cheekbones and dark eyes that suggested Apache ancestry, but skin tone and facial structure that hinted at Spanish or Mexican influences. Her clothing combined traditional Apache elements with items that clearly came from white settlements, creating a style that was both exotic and somehow familiar. "Come," Bright Moon said simply, shouldering Margaret's traveling bag with casual efficiency. "The Women's Lodge is this way, and there are many questions that need answers." As Margaret prepared to follow her new guide, Chief Running Bear caught her arm gently. "Remember what we discussed about proving your worth through actions rather than words. Bright Moon is fair but not easily impressed. Win her respect, and you will have an important ally in the village." The Women's Lodge proved to be another impressive structure, smaller than Chief Running Bear's residence but obviously designed to house multiple occupants comfortably. The interior was divided into sleeping areas by hanging textiles, with a central fire pit providing warmth and light. Cooking areas along the walls suggested that the residents prepared their own meals rather than depending on communal facilities. Margaret was surprised to find that she was not the only resident. 3 other women occupied the lodge, 2 elderly widows who regarded her with frank curiosity, and a young mother with an infant who seemed more interested in her baby than in the unusual newcomer. "This will be your sleeping area," Bright Moon announced, indicating a space near the entrance that was clearly the least desirable location in the lodge. "You will share cooking duties with the others, contribute to the maintenance of the lodge, and follow all rules without question or complaint." Margaret set down her belongings and looked around her new home, trying to project confidence she didn't feel. The space was adequate but austere, furnished with simple bedding and basic storage containers. Everything was clean and well maintained. But there was no doubt that this was accommodation for those whose status in the community was uncertain or marginal. "Thank you for your kindness in taking me in," Margaret said, addressing Bright Moon but speaking loudly enough for the other women to hear. "I hope to prove myself worthy of your hospitality." One of the elderly women, a tiny, bird-like creature with sharp eyes and elaborate tattoos on her hands, spoke rapidly in Apache. Bright Moon's response included Margaret's name and several words that sounded like explanations or clarifications. "Grandmother Turtle wants to know if you can do useful work," Bright Moon translated. "She says the village has no need for useless mouths during winter, regardless of whose protection they enjoy." Margaret felt a flush of indignation at the blunt assessment, but she forced herself to respond calmly. "I can cook, sew, tend the sick, care for children, and help with any other tasks that need doing. I'm not afraid of hard work." Grandmother Turtle listened to the translation, then fired off another rapid question that made Bright Moon hesitate before translating. "She wants to know if you can skin a deer, tan hides, and make clothing from raw materials. She says white women are often helpless when faced with real work." Margaret straightened her shoulders, drawing on memories of frontier life before her retreat into solitude. "I skinned my first deer when I was 12 years old. I've tanned hides, made candles, spun thread, woven cloth, and done every other task necessary for survival in a harsh country. I may not know your specific methods, but I'm willing to learn." This answer seemed to satisfy Grandmother Turtle, who nodded approvingly and made what sounded like a comment of grudging respect. The young mother looked up from her baby long enough to offer Margaret a shy smile that suggested possible friendship in the future. "Good," Bright Moon said with what might have been approval. "Tomorrow we will see if your claims match your abilities. Tonight, you rest and observe. There will be a council meeting to discuss your presence here, and your future may depend on what is decided." As evening fell and the women of the lodge settled into their nighttime routines, Margaret found herself both exhausted and wide awake. The events of the past week had transformed her life so completely that she could barely remember the woman who had lived alone in a cabin, speaking to no one for days at a time. Now she was surrounded by people whose language she didn't speak, whose customs she didn't understand, and whose acceptance she would have to earn through daily proof of her worth. The challenge was overwhelming, but for the first time in 3 years, Margaret felt truly alive. Outside the lodge, she could hear the sounds of village life settling into evening patterns, children being called to meals, dogs barking at shadows, adults discussing the day's events around cooking fires. Somewhere among those conversations, she knew, her own fate was being debated by people who had every reason to view her with suspicion. As she lay on her simple bedding, listening to the soft breathing of her lodgemates and the distant sounds of the village, Margaret thought about the series of choices that had brought her to this moment. Each decision had seemed to lead inevitably to the next, creating a chain of consequences that had carried her far from anything she could have predicted. Tomorrow would bring new tests, new challenges, and new opportunities to prove that a white woman could find a place among the Apache. The outcome was far from certain, but for the first time since losing her family, Margaret felt that her life had purpose beyond mere survival. The wind whispered through the valley, carrying scents of smoke and snow, of wild places and settled communities, of a world far more complex and wonderful than she had ever imagined. Whatever the future held, Margaret knew that she would face it with courage and determination. The woman who had once hidden from life was gone forever, replaced by someone ready to fight for her place in a new world. The drums began at sunset, their deep rhythm echoing off the canyon walls with a resonance that seemed to penetrate Margaret's bones. She stood at the entrance of the women's lodge, watching as the entire village transformed around the approaching council meeting. Cooking fires were banked, children were gathered into family groups, and adults moved with the purposeful solemnity of people preparing for momentous decisions. Bright Moon appeared at her elbow, carrying a bundle of clothing that she thrust into Margaret's hands without ceremony. "You cannot appear before the council dressed as you are," she said firmly. "Your white woman's clothes will only remind them of what they fear most." Margaret unfolded the bundle to reveal a traditional Apache dress made from soft doeskin, decorated with intricate beadwork and patterns that seemed to tell stories she couldn't read. The garment was beautiful, but wearing it felt like assuming an identity she hadn't earned. "I'm not sure this is appropriate," Margaret said hesitantly. "I don't want to offend anyone by pretending to be something I'm not." Bright Moon's expression softened slightly. "The dress belonged to Chief Running Bear's wife. Grandmother Singing Wolf suggested you wear it, though she didn't explain her reasoning. Among our people, clothing carries meaning beyond mere decoration. Tonight, you need all the protection symbols can provide." The implications hit Margaret like a physical blow. Wearing the dead wife's dress would send messages to the council that she couldn't fully understand, creating associations and expectations. That might help or doom her depending on how they were interpreted. "Are you certain this is wise?" Margaret asked. "Nothing about your situation is wise," Bright Moon replied with brutal honesty. "But Grandmother Singing Wolf has lived through more tribal politics than any 3 warriors combined. If she thinks this will help, you should trust her judgment." Margaret changed into the doeskin dress with trembling fingers, marveling at how perfectly it fit despite the obvious differences between herself and its previous owner. The soft leather felt strange against her skin, and the weight of the beadwork created an unfamiliar awareness of her own movements. When she looked at herself in Bright Moon's small mirror, she saw a woman she barely recognized, someone who might actually belong in Apache village. "Better," Bright Moon said with satisfaction. "Now you look less like a spy and more like someone seeking a place among us." The sound of approaching footsteps announced Stormwalker's arrival. He appeared in the lodge entrance wearing full ceremonial regalia that transformed him from a simple warrior into something approaching a force of nature. His face was painted with symbols Margaret didn't recognize, and his clothing displayed a level of craftsmanship that spoke of the highest status within the tribe. "It is time," he announced formally. "The council waits, and Chief Running Bear has already spoken of your deeds. Now you must speak for yourself." The council lodge dominated the center of the village, a massive structure that could easily accommodate the entire adult population of Dulcie. As Margaret approached the entrance, flanked by Stormwalker and Bright Moon, she could see firelight flickering through the opening and hear the low murmur of many voices engaged in serious discussion. Inside, the lodge was arranged in concentric circles around a central fire pit. The innermost circle contained the tribal elders and war chiefs, men and women whose weathered faces spoke of decades of leadership and hard-won wisdom. The second circle held respected community members, successful hunters, skilled craftspeople, and family leaders whose opinions carried weight in tribal decisions. The outer rings accommodated younger adults and anyone else whose presence was considered appropriate for such proceedings. Chief Running Bear sat in the place of honor beside the fire, his ceremonial clothing magnificent in the firelight. Despite his recent injuries, he radiated the authority and dignity that had made him a leader among his people. When his eyes met Margaret's across the crowded lodge, she saw encouragement mixed with uncertainty about the outcome of the evening's deliberations. An elderly man Margaret hadn't seen before rose from his position near the fire and began speaking. In Apache, his voice carrying the resonant authority of someone accustomed to formal oratory. Stormwalker whispered quick translations in Margaret's ear, explaining that this was Windcaller, the tribe's most senior elder and keeper of traditional law. He speaks of ancient customs regarding strangers who seek shelter among the people. Stormwalker murmured. He reminds the council that our ancestors faced similar decisions when Spanish explorers first entered our territory. Margaret listened to the flowing cadences of the Apache language, picking up occasional words that seemed familiar from her days caring for Chief Running Bear. The speech went on for nearly 20 minutes, with Windcaller apparently reviewing precedents and traditional procedures for dealing with outsiders who requested protection or membership in the tribe. When the elder finished speaking, he gestured toward Margaret and spoke directly to her in careful English. "Woman of the white race, You stand before the council of the Jicarilla Apache, seeking acceptance among our people. This is not a request we take lightly, nor one with simple answers. You will speak now, and your words will be weighed against your actions to determine your worthiness. Margaret rose slowly, feeling the weight of dozens of pairs of eyes evaluating her every movement. She had spent hours preparing for this moment, but now all her carefully planned words seemed inadequate to the magnitude of what she was asking. Honored elders, she began, using the formal address Bright Moon had taught her. I come before you not as a conqueror or a spy, but as a woman who chose compassion over fear when your chief lay dying in the snow. I ask for nothing more than the chance to prove that my heart is true and my intentions honorable. Windcaller translated her words for those who didn't speak English, and Margaret could see reactions rippling through the assembled crowd. Some faces showed curiosity or cautious approval, while others displayed skepticism or outright hostility. An older woman, Margaret recognized as one of the senior council members, stood to address her directly. White woman, your people have brought nothing but death and disease to our lands. Why should we believe that you are different from the settlers who steal our hunting grounds and the soldiers who burn our villages? The challenge was delivered in a tone that brooked no evasion or diplomatic deflection. Margaret knew that her answer would be crucial to everything that followed. Because I have already proven my difference through my actions, Margaret replied firmly. When I found Chief Running Bear injured and helpless, I could have left him to die and claimed his weapons and horse as spoils. Instead, I risked my own life to save his, asking nothing in return. I judge people by their character, not their race, and I hope you will do the same for me. The woman's response was rapid Apache that prompted animated discussion throughout the lodge. Margaret caught enough emotional undertones to realize that her answer had sparked debate about fundamental questions of justice, mercy, and the possibility of trust between traditional enemies. Chief Running Bear rose to address the council, and the lodge fell silent with respect due to his position and reputation. He spoke for nearly 10 minutes in his own language, his voice carrying passionate conviction as he apparently argued Margaret's case before his people. When he finished, he turned to address her directly in English. I have told the council of your kindness, your skill in healing, and your courage in the face of danger. But words alone cannot determine your place among us. If you truly wish to join our people, you must undergo the trials that prove your worthiness and commitment. Margaret felt her heart skip as she realized that the council was not simply going to vote on her request. Like many indigenous societies, the Apache apparently required practical demonstrations of worthiness rather than mere declarations of intent. What trials would I face? She asked, hoping her voice sounded steadier than she felt. Windcaller consulted briefly with the other elders before responding. 3 tests, each designed to reveal different aspects of your character and capabilities. First, you must demonstrate practical skills necessary for survival in our community. Second, you must show a spiritual understanding of our beliefs and customs. Third, you must prove your loyalty to our people above your own race when faced with a direct challenge. The weight of what was being asked settled over Margaret like a heavy blanket. These weren't simple tasks designed to humble a newcomer, but serious challenges that would determine whether she could truly become part of Apache society. I accept your conditions, Margaret said without hesitation. When do the trials begin? Tomorrow at dawn, Windcaller replied. But tonight, there are other matters to address. He gestured toward Chief Running Bear, who stood again to address the council with obvious reluctance. The chief spoke quietly, but his words prompted immediate and heated discussion among the assembled leaders. Margaret could tell from the passionate responses that whatever he had said was controversial and potentially divisive. Storm Walker leaned close to provide translation. The chief speaks of the bond created by your saving his life. He reminds the council that such debts carry obligations under traditional law, obligations that affect not just him personally, but his status as a leader. Margaret felt ice forming in her stomach as she began to understand the political complexities surrounding her presence. Chief Running Bear's protection of her wasn't just a personal choice, but a decision that could affect his authority and the tribe's internal dynamics. An older warrior stood to challenge the chief directly, his voice carrying aggressive undertones that needed no translation. His gestures toward Margaret made his opinion clear, and several other council members nodded in apparent agreement with his position. Grey Wolf argues that harboring a white woman demonstrates weakness that enemies could exploit, Stormwalker whispered. He claims that other tribes will see the chief's protection of you as evidence that the Jicarilla have been corrupted by contact with white society. Chief Running Bear's response was firm and authoritative, but Margaret could see the strain on his face as he defended a position that clearly cost him political capital among his own people. The realization that her presence was creating difficulties for the man who had saved her life filled Margaret with guilt and determination in equal measure. The debate continued for over an hour, with various council members rising to express their opinions about Margaret's request and its implications for the tribe. Some voices supported the chief's position, arguing that showing mercy to enemies demonstrated strength rather than weakness. Others insisted that accepting a white woman into the tribe violated fundamental principles that had protected the Apache for generations. Finally, Windcaller called for silence and stood to deliver what was apparently the council's preliminary decision. He spoke first in Apache, then turned to address Margaret directly in English. The council recognizes the debt owed to you for saving Chief Running Bear's life, and we acknowledge that such debts carry traditional obligations. However, your integration into our tribe cannot be accomplished simply through the chief's protection. You must earn your place through your own efforts and prove your worthiness through the trials we have outlined. Margaret nodded, understanding that she was being offered a chance rather than a guarantee. I'm grateful for the opportunity to prove myself. Do not be grateful yet, Windcaller warned. The trials are designed to test the limits of your endurance, wisdom, and loyalty. Many who have attempted them have failed, and failure carries consequences you may not anticipate. As the formal council session concluded, Margaret found herself surrounded by tribal members eager to get a closer look at the white woman who had requested membership in their community. Some approached with obvious curiosity, asking questions about her background and motivations. Others maintained careful distance, their expressions suggesting that they viewed her as a threat to be watched, rather than a potential ally to be welcomed. Bright Moon materialized at her side, efficiently guiding Margaret through the crowd while deflecting the more aggressive questioners. Enough excitement for one evening, she announced firmly. Tomorrow brings challenges that require rest and preparation. As they made their way back to the women's lodge, Margaret became aware that Chief Running Bear was following at a discreet distance. When they reached the lodge entrance, he approached with the formal bearing that marked all his public interactions. "Walk with me," he said quietly. "There are things you must understand before tomorrow's trials begin." Margaret glanced at Bright Moon, who nodded encouragingly. "I will wait for you inside," Bright Moon said, "but do not stay out too long. The night is cold, and tomorrow will test your strength." Chief Running Bear led Margaret to a secluded area near the village edge where they could speak privately without being overheard. The moonlight cast stark shadows across his weathered features, making him appear both younger and older than his actual years. "The trials you face tomorrow are not simply tests of your personal abilities," he began without preamble. "They are political statements that will determine not just your fate, but my own authority within the tribe. If you fail, it will be seen as evidence that my judgment in protecting you was flawed." Margaret felt the weight of responsibility settling over her like a burial shroud. "I never intended to create problems for you. If my presence threatens your leadership, perhaps I should—" "No," Chief Running Bear interrupted firmly. "The choice has been made, and we must face the consequences together. But you must understand that tomorrow's trials will test more than your ability to perform specific tasks. They will measure your willingness to truly become Apache in your heart as well as your actions. What does that mean, exactly? Chief Running Bear was quiet for a long moment, studying her face in the moonlight. It means that if you succeed in the trials, you will cease to be Margaret Sullivan, White Widow from the Montana Territory. You will become someone new, with new loyalties, new obligations, and new identity. The woman you were before will be considered dead. The finality in his words sent chills down Margaret's spine. She had understood that joining the Apache would require changes in her lifestyle and daily routine, but she hadn't fully grasped that it might mean the complete erasure of her former identity. And if I'm not ready for such a transformation, then you will fail the trials, and the council will decide what to do with a white woman who knows too much about our village's location and defenses. Chief Running Bear replied with stark honesty. Margaret understood the implication without needing further explanation. Failure meant death, not exile or return to her former life. I should probably be frightened, she said after a moment of reflection. Probably, Chief Running Bear agreed. But I have watched you face impossible choices with courage and wisdom. Tomorrow will test those qualities to their limits, but I believe you possess the strength to succeed. As they walked back toward the women's lodge, Margaret found herself thinking about identity and transformation. For 3 years she had clung to her role as Thomas and Emma's widow, using grief as both shield and prison. Now she was being offered the chance to become someone entirely new, but only if she was willing to let the old Margaret die completely. The thought was terrifying and liberating in equal measure. Back in the lodge, she found her sleeping area, prepared with additional blankets and a small bundle of items that Bright Moon explained were gifts from various tribal members. Some people believe you might actually succeed tomorrow, Bright Moon said with a slight smile. They want to be remembered as supportive if you do. Margaret examined the gifts: a bone needle for sewing, a small knife with an intricately carved handle, a pouch of medicinal herbs, and a pair of moccasins lined with rabbit fur. Each item represented practical help for the challenges ahead, but also tentative gestures of acceptance from people who barely knew her. As she settled into her bedding for what might be her last night as Margaret Sullivan, she found herself thinking of Thomas and Emma one final time. Would they understand the choice she was making? Would they approve of her decision to embrace a completely new life rather than continuing to mourn their loss? In her heart, she believed they would. Thomas had always said that life was meant for living, not for hiding from pain and possibility. Emma had possessed an adventurous spirit that would have delighted in the challenges Margaret now faced. Wind whispered through the village, carrying scents of smoke and snow, of wild places and new beginnings. Tomorrow would bring trials that would either transform her into someone unrecognizable or end her journey entirely. But for the first time in years, Margaret felt truly ready to face whatever fate awaited her. She was no longer the broken woman who had fled into the wilderness to escape painful memories. She was someone ready to fight for a new identity, a new purpose, and a new life among people who valued courage above comfort and honor above safety. The drums had fallen silent, but their rhythm continued in her heartbeat as she drifted toward sleep. Tomorrow would determine whether Margaret Sullivan would live on as a memory, or be reborn as someone whose name would be spoken with respect in an Apache village for generations to come. The transformation had already begun. The only question was whether she possessed the strength to complete it. Dawn arrived with crystalline clarity that seemed to amplify every sound in the village. Margaret woke to find Bright Moon already moving about the lodge, preparing what appeared to be ceremonial items with careful precision. The other women were absent, having apparently risen even earlier to attend to their own responsibilities. Today, you begin the trials, Bright Moon said without preamble. offering Margaret a cup of bitter tea that smelled of unfamiliar herbs. "Drink this. It will give you strength and clarity for what lies ahead." Margaret accepted the tea gratefully, though its taste was harsh enough to make her grimace. "What can you tell me about what I'll face?" Bright Moon hesitated, clearly weighing how much information she should share. "The first trial tests practical skills essential for survival in our community. You will be required to demonstrate competence in tasks that every Apache woman must master. The second trial examines your understanding of our spiritual beliefs and your ability to show proper respect for the sacred aspects of our culture. The third—" She paused, her expression growing troubled. "The third is the most dangerous," she continued quietly. "It tests your loyalty to our people when faced with a direct conflict between Apache interests and white civilization. Many who attempt this trial discover that their commitment to their new identity is not as complete as they believed." Margaret felt her stomach tighten with apprehension. "Has anyone ever passed all 3 trials?" "A few," Bright Moon replied. "But most who attempt them are Apache by blood who were raised in white society and seek to return to their people. You would be the first white person by birth to face these challenges." The implications of that statement settled over Margaret like a weight. She wasn't just attempting to prove her individual worthiness, but potentially establishing a precedent that could affect future interactions between the Apache and white society. "What happens if I fail?" Bright Moon's expression became carefully neutral. "That decision would rest with the council." "But Margaret—" She used the white name deliberately, as if to emphasize what would be lost. "You must understand that these trials are designed to break down your old identity completely. If you succeed, the woman who entered this village 3 days ago will cease to exist. You will be given a new name, new responsibilities, and new loyalties that supersede all previous attachments." Margaret considered this as she finished the bitter tea. The prospect of complete transformation was both terrifying and oddly appealing. For 3 years, she had carried the weight of grief and loss like chains around her spirit. The chance to become someone entirely new offered possibilities she had never dared to imagine. "I'm ready," she said, and was surprised to discover that she meant it. The first trial took place in a cleared area near the village center, with most of the community gathered to observe. Margaret found herself facing a series of stations, each designed to test specific skills considered essential for Apache women. Windcaller stood at the center of the area, wearing full ceremonial regalia that marked the solemnity of the proceedings. "Woman who seeks to join our people," he announced in formal tones, "you will demonstrate your ability to contribute to our community's survival and prosperity. At each station, you must complete the assigned task to the satisfaction of the examining elder. Failure at any station means failure of the entire trial." Margaret nodded her understanding and approached the first station, where Grandmother Turtle waited with materials for hide preparation. The elderly woman's sharp eyes evaluated Margaret with obvious skepticism as she explained the task through an interpreter. "You must properly clean and prepare this deer hide for tanning," the interpreter explained. "The work must be completed with traditional tools and techniques. Any shortcuts or methods learned from white society will result in immediate failure." Margaret examined the tools, provided stone scrapers, bone needles, and plant-based solutions she didn't recognize. The hide itself was fresh, still carrying the smell of recent death and requiring immediate attention to prevent spoilage. Drawing on childhood memories of helping her mother with similar tasks, Margaret began the laborious process of removing flesh and fat from the hide's interior surface. The work was physically demanding and required careful attention to avoid creating tears that would weaken the finished product. Grandmother Turtle watched every movement with critical attention, occasionally making comments to other observers that Margaret couldn't understand but suspected were less than complimentary. The task took nearly 2 hours to complete. Leaving, Margaret's hands cramped and her back aching from the constant bending and scraping. When she finally presented the cleaned hide for inspection, Grandmother Turtle examined it with meted attention before nodding grudging approval. The second station tested her ability to prepare traditional foods using only indigenous ingredients and cooking methods. Margaret found herself working with corn, beans, squash, and various wild plants under the supervision of an elderly man whose weathered hands demonstrated techniques that had been passed down through generations. You must prepare a meal suitable for a family of 6, using only these ingredients and that fire pit, the supervisor explained through his interpreter. The food must be properly cooked, seasoned according to our traditions, and prepared in quantities that would satisfy hungry adults. Margaret studied the available ingredients, trying to recall everything she had observed about Apache cooking during her brief time in the village. The challenge was not just technical, combining unfamiliar ingredients using traditional methods, but cultural, requiring her to demonstrate understanding of Apache culinary preferences and nutritional needs. She began by preparing the corn, grinding it between stones to create a meal while simultaneously starting a fire using traditional friction methods rather than the matches she knew were available. The process was time-consuming and required constant attention to prevent burning or uneven cooking. As she worked, Margaret became aware that her audience was growing. Word of the trials had apparently spread throughout the village, and people were arriving to observe her performance. Some faces showed curiosity or encouragement, but others displayed skepticism or outright hostility that made her hands tremble as she attempted delicate seasoning adjustments. The meal she eventually presented included corn cakes, stewed beans flavored with wild herbs, roasted squash, and a broth made from bones and foraged plants. The examining elder tasted each component with careful attention before consulting quietly with Grandmother Singing Wolf, who had arrived to observe this portion of the trial. Their whispered discussion seemed to go on forever, but finally the elder nodded approval. "Acceptable," he announced, and Margaret felt relief flood through her body like warm water. The third station tested her knowledge of traditional crafts, specifically the creation of useful items from natural materials. Margaret found herself facing a collection of reeds, plant fibers, and sinew, with instructions to create a watertight basket suitable for carrying liquids. This challenge pushed her skills to their absolute limits. Basket weaving was an art form she had attempted only rarely, and creating containers capable of holding water required techniques she had never mastered. The examining elder, a middle-aged woman, whose own baskets were works of art, watched with professional interest as Margaret struggled with the complex weaving patterns. Hours passed as Margaret worked, her fingers growing increasingly clumsy with fatigue and cold. Several times she was forced to start over when her weaving proved inadequate, or when she made errors that would have compromised the basket's functionality. The audience grew restless, and she could hear murmured conversations that suggested some observers were losing confidence in her abilities. Finally, as afternoon shadows began to lengthen, Margaret completed a basket that appeared to meet the basic requirements. The examining elder filled it with water and waited to see if any leaks would develop. Several tense minutes passed before she nodded satisfaction and emptied the container. "The first trial is completed successfully," Wind Caller announced to the assembled crowd. "Tomorrow we'll bring the second trial, which tests spiritual understanding and cultural respect." As the crowd dispersed, Margaret found herself surrounded by a small group of women who had watched her performance with obvious interest. Their comments were in Apache, but their tones suggested a mixture of surprise and grudging respect for her accomplishments. Bright Moon appeared at her side, efficiently guiding her away from the crowd and back toward the women's lodge. "You did well," she said quietly. "Better than many expected, including some who wagered against your success." "People were betting on my performance?" Margaret asked, not sure whether to be amused or offended. "The Apache enjoy contests of skill and courage," Bright Moon replied with a slight smile. Your trials have provided entertainment as well as drama. Some who bet against you are now reconsidering their positions. That evening, Margaret found herself the subject of increased attention from village residents who had previously ignored her presence. Several families invited her to share their evening meals, and she was included in conversations that ranged from practical advice about the upcoming trials to stories about the history and traditions of the Jicarilla people. The attention was both welcome and overwhelming. After 3 years of solitude, being the center of so much social interaction felt strange and exhausting. Yet Margaret also sensed that she was being evaluated as a potential community member rather than simply observed as a curiosity. Chief Running Bear approached her as she sat by one of the communal fires, listening to an elderly storyteller recount ancient legends about the creation of the Apache people. He settled beside her with careful attention to his still healing injuries, his presence immediately commanding respect from the other listeners. Tomorrow's trial will be more challenging than today's, he said quietly, speaking just loudly enough for her to hear over the storyteller's voice. Spiritual understanding cannot be faked or improvised. You must demonstrate genuine comprehension of beliefs that may conflict with your Christian upbringing. Margaret felt a flutter of anxiety as she considered the implications. What exactly will be expected of me? You will be tested on your knowledge of Apache spiritual beliefs, your ability to participate appropriately in sacred ceremonies, and your willingness to accept the guidance of our spiritual leaders, Chief Running Bear explained. This may require you to set aside religious teachings you have held since childhood. The challenge was more complex than Margaret had anticipated. She had assumed that spiritual understanding meant learning new beliefs alongside her existing faith, not potentially replacing Christian doctrine with Apache spirituality. What if I cannot in good conscience abandon my Christian beliefs? She asked. Chief Running Bear's expression grew troubled. Then you will fail the trial, and the council will conclude that your commitment to joining our people is incomplete. Margaret spent much of that night lying awake in her bedding, wrestling with questions that had no easy answers. Could she honestly embrace Apache spiritual beliefs while maintaining her Christian faith? Was it possible to honor both traditions, or would she be forced to choose between them? The second trial began before dawn with a purification ceremony. That required Margaret to participate in rituals she had never witnessed before. She found herself in a sweat lodge with several Apache women, enduring temperatures and humidity levels that tested her physical endurance, while spiritual leaders chanted prayers and offered guidance about proper participation. The ceremony was followed by a series of tests that examined her knowledge of Apache creation stories, spiritual practices, and sacred symbols. Margaret was required to demonstrate understanding of concepts that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of divinity, the relationship between humans and the natural world, and the proper ways to honor spiritual forces. Some questions had objective answers that could be memorized and recited. Others required her to interpret spiritual teachings and apply them to hypothetical situations that tested her comprehension of underlying principles. Still others demanded that she participate in ritual activities that felt uncomfortably similar to practices her Christian upbringing had taught her to view as pagan or even demonic. The most challenging moment came when she was asked to explain her understanding of the Apache concept of spiritual power and how it differed from Christian notions of divine authority. Margaret found herself struggling to articulate ideas that seemed to exist at the intersection of her old beliefs and new understanding. The Apache see spiritual power as something that flows through all living things, she said carefully, aware that her answer was being evaluated by spiritual leaders whose authority within the tribe was absolute. It is not distant or separate from daily life, but present in every aspect of existence. This power must be respected and properly honored, but it can also be accessed and directed by those who understand its nature. The examining elder, an ancient woman whose face was marked with traditional tattoos that spoke of decades of spiritual service, listened to Margaret's explanation with intense concentration. Her response was a series of questions that probed deeper into Margaret's comprehension of concepts that had no direct equivalent in Christian theology. How does one properly approach the spirits of deceased ancestors? The elder asked through an interpreter. What obligations do the living have toward those who have passed beyond the physical world? Margaret thought of Thomas and Emma, and suddenly the question became intensely personal rather than merely academic. The dead remain connected to us through love and memory, she said slowly. We honor them by living according to the values they taught us and by seeking their guidance when we face difficult decisions. They are not gone, only transformed into a different form of existence. The elder's expression revealed nothing of her thoughts as she continued the questioning. And what of the spirits that inhabit natural places, the mountains, rivers, and forests? How should humans relate to these forces? With respect and gratitude, Margaret replied, drawing on observations she had made during her time in the village. The land provides everything necessary for life, but it is not ours to own or exploit. We are temporary caretakers who must ensure that our actions do not damage the delicate balance that sustains all living things. The examination continued for hours, covering topics that ranged from proper ritual behavior to the interpretation of dreams and omens. Margaret found herself drawing not just on information she had learned during her brief time among the Apache, but on spiritual insights that seemed to emerge from some deeper source of understanding. As the day progressed, she realized that something fundamental was shifting in her worldview. The spiritual concepts she was being asked to embrace didn't negate her Christian beliefs so much as expand them, offering new ways to understand the divine presence she had always sensed in the natural world. When the second trial finally concluded, Margaret felt emotionally and spiritually exhausted. The examining elder conferred quietly with other spiritual leaders before announcing the results. You have demonstrated an acceptable understanding of our spiritual beliefs and proper respect for our sacred traditions, the elder declared. Tomorrow you will face the final trial, which tests the strength of your commitment to our people. That night, Margaret found herself unable to sleep despite her exhaustion. The third trial loomed ahead like a storm on the horizon, carrying with it implications she could barely imagine. Bright Moon had warned her that it would test her loyalty to the Apache when faced with conflicts between tribal interests and white civilization, but what exactly would that mean? As she lay in her bedding, listening to the soft breathing of her lodge mates and the distant sounds of the village settling into sleep, Margaret wondered if she truly possessed the strength to complete the transformation that had begun when she pulled sheaf running there from the snowstorm. Tomorrow would determine whether she would emerge from the trials as a new person with a new identity, or whether the journey would end in failure and the consequences that followed. The wind whispered through the canyon walls, carrying scents of snow and wood smoke, of ancient traditions and uncertain futures. Margaret closed her eyes and tried to imagine herself as an Apache woman with an Apache name, committed to Apache values and loyal to Apache interests above all others. The image was both thrilling and terrifying. By tomorrow night, she would know whether it was also her destiny. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.